It's Often Show on the Team 980, always live as well on the free Odyssey app. Coming up at the top of the hour, Brian Baldinger joins us to break down Commanders and Eagles. But right now, it is our pleasure to welcome back to the show ESPN's Ramona Shelburne, of course, senior NBA writer, who not only is covering the Dame Lillard trade, but we're actually going to spend most of the time talking about the feature piece she wrote earlier this week on Commanders owner Josh Harris. Ramona, how are you? Welcome back to the show. Thank you.
Good. How are you?
I am doing well. So this piece was so good. And I got to say, it gave me a great chuckle when I kind of zoomed out mentally of the last 3 years, because the amount of times that we said, hey, there's an ESPN feature piece on the Commanders owner. And it was like, it just ruined our day was many. And then I'd spend half an hour on Zoom with Don Van Natta. But this is a fun story. This is a good story. This is a heartwarming story of a man who bought his childhood team, and you chronicled kind of what it meant to him, what it meant to some of the people around him. When did you decide you wanted to write this story, and why do you think Josh ultimately agreed to talk to you about doing it?
You know, it's interesting. It's I like stories. I always like stories that are interesting to me. Okay, and there's a sports business component to this story that I was interested in. And it's not just, I knew Josh a little bit from his time with the Philadelphia 76ers, but the fact that he was buying the Washington Commanders for $6 billion, right, which is like a staggering number, and now had teams in professional hockey, in football, in basketball, like they have the English Premier League. Like, this guy has a profile across all of sports now. That, I kind of ran some numbers. It'd be hard to say who has the largest set of holdings, right? Like, is it Stan Kroenke? Is it the Glazers, right? Because they have a couple of teams in the Premier. They have the Premier League, obviously, and then the Bucks and stuff. But he's up there, right? It's probably top 5 in terms of holdings, in North American sports, at least, definitely. And this is a guy that people don't know that much about. I mean, he's to be this consequential in terms of ownership and holdings in our field, and not have a huge public profile. He's kind of been, if anything, the guy that you know a lot about in terms of Sixers ownership is Michael Rubin, right? He's the guy throwing the white party in the Hamptons, and James Harden's, ride or die, right? And it's, but Josh Harris is just, okay, he's a rich guy. That's what people mostly knew about him. And so I was more interested in how does a guy who's become so important have such a low public profile?
Is it something that he has done on purpose, do you think, like trying to stay out of the spotlight, or is it just the way that he goes about his business that he doesn't have this very high public profile, that he's kind of just like this private finance guy that is not on the surface that interesting?
Yeah, he, I think it's actually on purpose. I think when you run, when you manage hundreds of billions of dollars in private equity, you don't want to be out there running your mouth and saying stupid stuff that's going to, that could hurt shareholder value, right? That could get you in trouble. And I think, guys like who have the means that Josh Harris does, generally they limit their exposures. Like, you don't want to put yourself out there. It's like you should, and I think, especially in Philadelphia, and this was something that Josh and I talked about a lot in our interviews for this piece on the Commanders. He thinks he is, if he could go back and do the beginning of the Philadelphia years over, his take was that he should have been out more in front, that people need to know you and people need to see you and at least have some opinion of you or some interaction with you in terms of who you are when you're running a franchise like the Sixers or the Commanders. And I pressed him a bit on it because, they first thing he did when he bought the Sixers, maybe not the first thing, but because they went to the playoffs the first year, but right after that is when they begin this process where they go this YOLO tanking strategy with Sam Hinkie. And it's a pretty radical thing to do in the NBA at the time. Now everybody kind of does it, but you didn't hear from ownership. You didn't hear from Sam Hinkie. You just saw Brett Brown out there every night, the head coach. And, I think they could only explain it so much because you don't want, there's certain ways you have to talk about tanking in the NBA and stuff. But I think for him, I think he looks back on that time, we probably should have been more out in front, if, especially as buying a franchise like the Sixers. And that's just a function of what you learn in 12 years of ownership. Of like, you can't just be in the shadows. People have to see you and know you.
Ramona Shelburne, ESPN.com. Of course, she's on ESPN on TV all the time as well, talking hoops, but talking her feature story on Josh Harris with us here on the Hoffman Show. It's one of the things that I really wanted to ask Harris if I got the chance, and if I get to interview him here in the next couple of months. Certainly something that I will be asking is, like, does he have a football philosophy? Because I think when you come in and you make such a drastic move like he did with the process with the Sixers, like, to me that says you've thought about this stuff, that you have certain philosophies on whether the way business should be run. And maybe he thought of it in kind of the private equity, distressed asset type of way. Or maybe he just is like, I've been watching the NBA long enough that if you don't have a superstar player, you got to go get one. And he seems to just kind of be deferring everything to the current football staff here with the Commanders. But do you think underlying somewhere in the back of his mind, he's thought about how to build a championship football contender in the same level of detail that he was able to implement quickly with the Sixers?
I would say not yet. The vibe I got from spending time with those guys is they spent so much time on the deal. It was a very complicated deal to be talking to Dan Snyder and negotiating. I think there was really three bidders that were actively involved all the way through, and then there was always the shadow of Jeff Bezos and whether he would come in at the end and outspend everybody, because he certainly could have if he wanted to. And I think that you had to negotiate through all the legal issues that Dan was going through, and how does that affect the sale? What are the assets that they're getting? The practice facility, the stadium, all the other, and it was just a really complicated deal. And they closed a month before the season.
Yeah.
So he had this story about I had literally a 1-day walkthrough at the field, and then he's just kind of been observing everyone and observing everything and how they are operating. And there's been a lot of changes at the Commanders the last year or two ever since the investigations. They've really turned over a lot of staff, and they've turned over a lot of processes. So you have new people there that were not part of the problem, right? They were hired as part of trying to change things over. And so I think he's really evaluating what he's bought, what have they bought. And I know in talking to both him and Mitch Rales, who's the minority owner, and Josh was vague, but he was specific in a way. In the NFL, you have to have 30% to be the majority owner. He goes, I'm well north of that. And the next biggest shareholder was Mitch Rales, who's around 10. So Josh Harris is really the largest shareholder here. And I think they have a lot of big plans, right? A lot of, what do we do with the practice facility? What do we do with the stadium? And these big plans are all going to be hard and complicated over the next decade. But it feels like they're all diving into big things over the course of the next decade, but also very granularly trying to make the stadium experience better, tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, if they can. And so in terms of football philosophy, other than, here's what I heard. They like the quarterback, and it would help them if the team wins right now, because it buys you some time in that honeymoon period, right? But I think there's a lot to tackle. And one of the quotes I think in the story that I think you should pay attention to is sometimes you should take your time before making decisions. He was basically saying we're not going to rush into anything here. We're going to figure out what we have before we make any big giant moves and swings.
Right. And when you take over a month before the season, there's no time to do anything anyway. So what's the rush? I think I learned more from your story than anything else that I had read or consumed about the relationships that are kind of behind this deal. I think more have been written a little bit about Mark Ein and Josh Harris's relationship. Yeah. But can you share with our audience who and obviously for the full story, they should read your story. Reading, it's essential. But the relationship between Mitch Rales and Josh Harris, how it started, why it started, and then why it became so important as they ultimately worked together to buy the team.
This was a fun part of the story, and if you haven't read it, it's okay. I don't want to get long.
I'll scold them, Ramona. You get to just play the good cop here.
Okay. So Mark Ein is literally grew up in the same neighborhood as Josh Harris. And they were childhood friends. I think they played together growing up. They went to the same schools in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Like these are, they just happened to both grow up and be billionaires. I'm not sure if Mark is a billionaire, but certainly
he's very close, and I certainly do not have anything remotely close to that in my life. Where it's like, hey, you want to grow up and be billionaires? Sure, that'd be nice.
It's like literally like your neighborhood bestie, and you both grow up and
Nuts.
Yeah. So it's those guys have known each other forever, and in 2021, kind of towards the beginning of 21. Josh sort of, steps down from his post at Apollo. It wasn't really like his choosing. Nobody pushed him, but he wasn't looking to leave. He just lost the power struggle, right? It was Leon Black, who was the CEO. There was a lot of controversy around him and his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. I think there was Epstein paid him some money, and there was a dispute over all that. And he was going to step down as CEO, and there was a power struggle between Josh and another guy in the firm. Josh lost this power struggle and leaves Apollo Global Management, which is the company that he's founded 32 years ago and has become a billionaire by managing its portfolio. So it's, your life's work is basically, the company you built is now gone, right? You're out. And he goes on this listening tour. He goes, talks to all the other smart guys that he knows and gals and gets their opinion about like what he should do next. What do you do when the thing you've been building for 30 years is now over? And Mark Ein, his childhood friend, said, you really got to talk to Mitch Rales. And Mitch is this guy who's DC area guy, has had, I looked up if you go look up his business profile, it's really unbelievable. It's like he's kind of founded like 3 or 4 different companies that he starts this company and then it builds it into a, multinational or billion-dollar company. And he's really reinvented himself several times, personally and professionally, right? And now he's this big guy in the art world. Right? It's like he went from, all this stuff, in business, and now he runs a national gallery. He has a big art gallery, and Mitch is they didn't know each other. I think 2 rich guys in DC, they knew of each other, but they didn't know each other. And this is how that's how they meet in 2021. It was, I think they had a lunch at the museum that Mitch owns in Bethesda. And he basically says to him, like, hey, why would you want to be at some place that doesn't want you? You're like a young guy. You've got another run left in you. Go do something great. And, pretty quickly afterwards, Josh pivots and starts his own fund called 26 North. And then he also starts to say, no, I want to do the NFL. And they put together this bid for the Broncos that fails, but it kind of whet his appetite for the NFL. And pretty soon afterwards is when the Commanders become available. And Josh, being a Washington, D.C. native, he was able to pivot and put together a group to start purchasing the Commanders pretty quickly because he knew, the writing was on the wall for Dan Gilbert. I think all you guys, I just said Dan Gilbert. There I go with my NBA reference for Dan Snyder. I think you guys, you said it before, like every time ESPN would publish a story, you look up Washington Post and New York Times, and like every single day there was a new yucky story. And for a couple of years there. And I think it was kind of the writing was on the wall, and Josh, being a native of the area, he was tracking it pretty closely and was in close enough position to cultivate a relationship with Dan Snyder before once he finally decided to sell.
So that leads to my final question. So he buys the team, and I'd be remiss if I did not ask you about this, Ramona. His first big public appearance nationally after he had done some great stuff locally was on Monday Night Football on ESPN in the preseason, and he's standing between Joe Buck and Troy Aikman. We learned from your story he's standing on a box, and the infamous handshake with Joe Buck, or half shake because Joe Buck wasn't shaking. When did you decide I'm going for this? I'm asking him about that moment, and what was his reaction when you did?
Well, I was standing there. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Part of the access to the story was that I was with him in that preseason game, and he comes out of the interview, and I didn't see the handshake because we were kind of behind him. Like I didn't, that whole thing happened on social media, and like I'm like listening on a headset, so
wow.
I can see the box, and I'm like, I can't believe that they got him to stand on a freaking box. Like this guy's worth $6 billion. And we, like I have to stand on a box. I'm 5'2", and so when I interview NBA players, if I can, I will get on a box so that it's not ridiculous looking, right? Like, they're 7 feet tall and I'm 5'2". But to ask a billionaire like that to do that is quite an ask. And he just did it. Like he was like, yeah, whatever, okay. Like, and I thought that was pretty cool. I was like, that showed me something, that he was not too self-important.
Did we lose? I think we lost Ramona. That stinks. Oh, I think the phone's coming back. I think we got you back, Ramona. There, we lost you for a second.
No, it was like I thought that showed something, that he was willing to like get on the box and not didn't have any qualms about it. Like he wasn't worried like, oh, it's gonna make me look short. Anyway, the handshake happened, and I didn't know. I was standing there with him when Dave Schaller, who's the guy that we all know from the Sixers, was kind of helping run point on this, and he goes, yeah, it went really well, except for this one funny moment in. He shows Josh the handshake, and like you could tell Josh like realizes like, oh, like in the moment I don't think he realized it was what happens on national TV, and in the moment I think he was probably just going through it. But then of course Twitter sees all, the internet forgets nothing. We all have these moments where like sometimes something's going to be embarrassing, and other times you're like, oh, I didn't even notice that. Like, I kind of got the vibe from Josh that I don't even think he realized that was an embarrassing moment as it happened. But then when he sees the video, he's like, let me see it again.
That's great.
Okay, that's going to be the vibe. Okay, that's the takeaway. And it was like, look, I have done things like that on camera before, but, I thought he was pretty gracious and just like, what are you going to do? I thought he was going for a shake.
That's so good.
Laughed it off.
And it's funny because Mitchell Rales was in the press box this past weekend for the game, and actually my colleague across the hall, Grant Paulson, introduced himself, and he's like, Mr. Rales, and he goes, no, it's Mitchell. Like, just we don't do that.
We make a big point of that. Say, call me Josh, call me Mitch.
Right, and I think the contrast, like they're not trying to make a point of contrast to the last owner. But it by nature of how they are is an impossible to not notice contrast to Dan Snyder.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think Dan Snyder would have done the interview.
Of course,
right? He didn't do a lot of interviews while he was there. And then, do you think he would have stood on the box?
No.
Right? I mean,
0% chance.
Handshake, No,
Dan Snyder would have cut a hole in the broadcast booth so that Buck and Aikman were shorter than him.
Yeah, I mean, I was there with Jason Wright was standing right there, and it was like Gene Medina is standing right there. Those are people who had worked for Dan Snyder and all that, and you could just tell like they kind of are looking like, oh, is this gonna be okay here? Right? And it was totally fine. Like, and you could just like, I don't know if to your point, is this something that they decided in a meeting when they're buying the team? Like, hey, this is what we got to do, or is this just how they are? It's hard to know, right? It's hard to know if this was a conscious decision. I know they studied, this issue, and I know that they, had to have a take on it because they can articulate it very well. They all kind of say, like, it's important for us to be out front where people can see us and talk to us. Like, that's why they had meetings with the players and gave them their cell phones and said, what can we do to make your lives better? Like, that's been a point of emphasis because essentially, like, they bought the team so close to the season, there's not much else they can do except be forward facing and say, hey, we're here now. And what can we do to help you?
100%. You did such a great job chronicling it. I have 1,000 more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time, and you've already given us quite a bit of it. So I'm just going to say thank you. And when you're in D.C. next time, hopefully we can catch up a little bit more on this. And we didn't even get to your day job. You didn't get to Lillard and the trade.
Lillard. Yeah.
But you're talking about that plenty of other places. So we'll people want to find your opinions on that. I'm sure there's podcasts and ESPN platforms that they can do that. Ramona Shelburne, ESPN.com. Thank you so much for your time. And people, if you have not read the piece, go do that. Thanks, Ramona. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig.
All right. Ramona Shelburne, everybody. ESPN.com, senior NBA writer. The other things, just for the record, Anthony, because I'm not saying this just to say this, like I have 1,000 more questions. Things I would like to know from Ramona that we literally do not have time for because Brian Baldinger is going to join us in 7 minutes, and we have a 6-minute break, so I got to be quick. I would love to know her opinion of Jason Wright. I would love to know whether, like, Ron Rivera's not quoted in the story. Is that just not needed? Or, there's been all these rumblings of, Jason this, Ron that. Like, is there any truth to that? I don't know that she would have insight on that, but, like, I'd be curious to know if she got any insight from Ron. And I don't want to say he's not quoted in the story because I'm not 100% sure in remembering. But, like, I'd be curious to know from a football side what early impressions are of Harris, and then from a business side what early impressions are of Harris. But I would love to know, as someone who's been around the business for a long time, what Ramona's take on Jason Wright is. I would love to know more about kind of Harris's conversations with Snyder. That's something that they talk about a little bit in the piece, and I'm curious if there's more meat on that bone because, like, as she talks about in the
late
piece,
those long nights.
Like there was like a courting process from Josh Harris to Dan Snyder, because we know Dan is like a vindictive, very particular, insert a bunch of other words here type of dude. And so, like, Josh knew if I'm going to get this team, he's got to like me. And so choices were made, and how cognizant was he of those types of things as he kind of courted that to be like, hey, man, if you sell this, I want to be the guy and start developing a relationship, but also not feel like you're the one pushing him out. Like, that had to be really tough, and I'd be more curious about that. So that's just like 3 of my 1,000 questions that I have for Ramona. It's a really good story. And again, it was nice to say, oh, there's an ESPN.com story on the Commanders owner, and it not mean we had to blow up the entire rundown, and I'm furiously texting Don Van Natta to set up a Zoom.
I think those are fair questions, especially the Jason Wright one.
I'm so interested.
That one's very unique.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. I love that Ramona was there. How did you know about the box thing? Because I was there, and I stand on a box. You know who doesn't stand on a box? Brian Baldinger. He's very tall, big man, used to play in the NFL. Now he breaks it down. He is a member of our Odyssey family, one of our Odyssey NFL insiders. He also does some work covering the Eagles, and he is the analyst for Compass Radio's NFL coverage in terms of the color analysis on the national broadcast. And their game this weekend is Commanders-Eagles. So Baldy is going to join us to talk about all of it next.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.